The sweaty, middle-aged white man takeover. Chapter 9. Takeover. The sweaty, middle-aged white man threw his basket full of items onto the conveyor belt. Looking at her name tag, he said, "That's your real name?" "Mimi," she said cheerily, beginning to scan his items. "That's me." For the first time in 3 years, she didn't mind idle chatter from male customers. Soon, she'd be out of here. She had called Imani first thing this morning and was told that both Imani and Daryl were out of the office, but that they would call her back tomorrow. When she'd gone to work, she'd imagined the conversation she'd soon have with Herbie, Save Mart manager and first-class dick. She had 2 words for him. "See ya." But she decided it was better to speak to Imani or Daryl first before doing anything rash. It wasn't official yet. Sometimes I see people wearing name tags and think, that girl doesn't look like a Diane or a Gwen. Like they picked up any tag. The man rambled on, though she wasn't paying him much attention. She couldn't stop daydreaming about being solo. Maybe she could record some of her own songs instead of the mediocre material that Kenny had made them record for the demo. "You ever feel like doing that?" "Doing what?" she asked. "Pretending to be someone else." "All the time," she said, thinking, those days are over. She was going to be a signed recording artist, a solo artist. Goodbye, Toledo. Goodbye, Save Mart, and goodbye, Jerry. The man leaned closer and whispered, "You know, I like the sisters." "And goodbye to jackasses like you," she thought gleefully. "Maybe I'll see you again sometime soon," the sweaty, sister-loving irritant said as he handed her a 20. She broke into a wide smile and replied, "Not around here you won't." She got out of work early by faking an upset stomach and cruised around the mall. Everything looked different. When she saw couples holding hands, she didn't feel the slightest twinge of jealousy. She was going to have songs on the radio and videos on MTV, and Jamal was going to be sorry for what he'd done to her. And New York was a big city. She'd meet somebody better than Jamal in no time. Someone who was going to treat her right and adore her. She went into a couple of stores, and instead of agonizing about making purchases like she usually did, she treated herself. 2 pairs of shoes at 9 West, and 3, count 'em, 3, pairs of jeans at the Gap. She was worth it. And then, instead of taking the bus home, she called a cab. Usually she did that only if she was working late at night, and even then only if she couldn't get a ride from someone at the store. She wondered what her mother would say. She hadn't told her about it because Angela got hysterical about everything, good or bad. And if Jerry had gotten wind of it, he would have tied her up and taken her back to New York himself and tried to collect a finder's fee. She decided she'd wait and tell them once she knew for sure. That was her plan. But when the cab pulled up to her house, she realized something was definitely up. The limo parked out front tipped her off. She opened the front door and laid eyes on the oddest assemblage of people she'd ever seen. Imani was sitting at the kitchen table with Angela, who was holding a mug of coffee in an unsteady hand. Daryl was perched on the kitchen counter, tapping like mad on his 2-way. The guy they called Witchy, who had been at the audition, was reclining in the armchair, holding the TV remote control and talking on his cell. At one end of the sofa was Jerry, who for once had the decency to be wearing jeans and a shirt with sleeves instead of his usual grubby boxers and wife-beater. Lamont was huddled all the way at the other end as if Jerry were covered in anthrax. She walked in, and all 6 people in the cramped space looked up at her. "Nice place you've got here," Lamont said in greeting. Mimi cringed, having a blinding flashback to Lamont's luxurious digs. All the things she had stopped noticing about their ramshackle house came into sharp focus. The clanging radiator, the grease spot on the kitchen wall, the threadbare carpet under Lamont's polished black shoes. "Mimi, why didn't you tell us?" Angela wailed. "They want you to sign a record deal." "I was informed," Lamont said, "that you're having some second thoughts." Lamont glanced crossly at Darrell, who seemed to be trying to hide behind the kitchen wall. Darrell passed the buck and slapped Imani with a murderous glare. That nosy bitch had to call Mimi when he told her not to, and of course she'd then gone and snitched to Lamont. "But we told him you're going to take it," Jerry chimed in. "Who are you to tell them anything?" Mimi snapped. She could already see his pupils turning into dollar signs. Ka-ching! Angela was sitting silently at the kitchen table, afraid to make a peep in front of these people. When they'd rung her doorbell this afternoon, she hadn't known what was going on, but she'd tried to be hospitable. Once they'd explained the purpose of their visit, they tried to contact Mimi at work, but she had already left, and no one knew where she'd gone. Lamont sat down, apparently to wait for Mimi's return, though he hadn't asked if he could stay. Then everyone else settled in because he had. Lamont didn't look like Angela imagined a rap person would. The only hip-hop person she really could identify was Puff Daddy. If the name P. Diddy had come up, she would have thought that was someone or something entirely different. And when she'd seen him on TV, he usually wore lots of gaudy jewelry and a shifty expression. Lamont was wearing a fancy navy pinstripe suit with a crisp white shirt open at the neck and some beautiful jewelry, one diamond earring, and a lovely pinky ring. He seemed very nice, and his executive assistant was such a pleasant girl. Jerry had come home a while ago and been briefed. He confidently declared that this was a good deal Lamont was offering and Mimi should take it. Angela had no opinion of her own, but if Jerry said it was good, it must be. He'd been a used car salesman for more than 10 years. He knew from deals. "We brought the contracts," Lamont said to Mimi. Imani rushed over and put them on the coffee table. "You can read it all in black and white right here," Lamont reassured her. "We already showed them to your folks." "Jerry is not my folks," Mimi said as she flipped through the papers. It was all in legal language that she couldn't decipher, and there must have been over 100 pages. Lamont was getting antsy but tried not to show it. He'd expected to have things rolling by now. He wanted her in the studio singing on that Fat E record. He wanted the I's dotted, the T's crossed. Done. The mother, in Lamont's opinion, with her mango-dyed, feathered hair and jowls that drooped like a basset hound, was stunningly unattractive. When she'd opened the door and he'd gotten a load of her, he'd struggled to hide his distaste. Pushing out cute little Mimi had obviously been her finest hour. The Haitian father must have been one attractive dude. And then this cat Jerry had shown up. He thought he only had to deal with the mother. He and Witchy had to back it up and roll out their "she's going to be a big star" shtick all over again. Lamont restlessly twisted his white gold pinky ring. He'd decided platinum was played. It wasn't like he'd had any desire to fly to fucking Toledo. He might have just sent Darrell, but after the mess Darrell had already made of this, he couldn't trust him. Neither was Witchy a sure bet. So he decided to hop on a plane this morning and get it done himself. He made Darrell and Witchy come along as punishment. They were cramped in coach, seated side by side, which pissed them both off, while he and Imani luxuriated in first class. Lamont hadn't yelled at them. In fact, he hadn't said a word to them directly all day. While he'd often bark, shout, make demands and threats, he wasn't an out-of-control screamer. That undercut one's authority. Like they said, thin line between love and hate. He preferred the silent treatment. He'd found saying nothing spoke volumes. There was nothing worse than being ignored. He brought Imani along for the feminine touch. He didn't want to show up 3 guys barging into this poor woman's house. And damn, she really was poor. Now that he'd gotten a peek at things, the scene was looking pretty desperate. Mimi was going to turn down the deal to stay here? He probably could have shown up with a C-note and a McDonald's Happy Meal and gotten her to sign. And by God, they'd better be able to catch the last flight home, or else there was going to be some out-of-control screaming tonight. If he got stuck at some airport motel in this third-rate town, Witchy and Daryl were both going to find a $400 John Lobb shoe stuck up their incompetent asses. Mimi sat down between Lamont and Jerry on the sofa. "You know, I actually called the office this morning," she said, "because I've changed my mind." Lamont shot death rays at Daryl, who stepped behind the kitchen wall so they'd miss him. "I thought you would," Lamont said easily, handing her his Mont Blanc pen. "I suppose I don't have to read all this today," she said, clearly eager to begin her new life. "Just show me. Where do I sign?" Lamont gingerly held the pages as Mimi signed her name in all 53 places marked with "Sign Here" post-its. He gave her a hug when she was done. Imani told Mimi she'd call her first thing tomorrow to discuss plane reservations and arrange any shipping services she might need. Lamont didn't like to shake hands with people, germs, but he gallantly went over and shook Angela's hand, then reluctantly shook Jerry's, bidding them a fond adieu before he stomped out. The others were close behind, practically tripping over each other to get out of the house, though Daryl and Witchy were bracing themselves for the verbal tirade to come. With Lamont, you never knew when the storm would hit. Jerry and Angela stood in the doorway, smiling from ear to ear. Lamont turned back and waved one last time before he ducked inside the limo. As soon as the door was closed, Lamont held out his hands to Imani. Having used her superpowers to anticipate her boss's every need, she already had an antibacterial wet nap ready. She slipped off his pinky ring and thoroughly wiped him down. Disc 2. All the King's Women. Chapter 10. Things Done Changed. They had her farewell party at Winky's. Mimi and Toya got tipsy off a cheap bottle of champagne. Keisha got sick from eating too much cake. Kenny, furious that she'd gotten a deal without him, showed up ranting and raving and was tossed out onto the street by Winky himself. Angela cried the whole time, her tears a mixture of joy and sadness. The next day, Mimi was off to New York. Her first week in the city was already booked solid. Imani had given her an Hermes appointment book as a present and taken the liberty of filling it with appointments. Mimi had lunch with Allison Beth Cohen, the PR dynamo who ran ABC Publicity, the firm that handled the TLE account. She was an impossibly thin, bleached blonde tornado of a woman who walked very fast, but took tiny steps. Everyone called her Allie C, like she was a rapper or something. She went shopping at Pottery Barn with Imani for some knickknacks to warm up the company apartment, which turned out to be Lamont's former residence, a spacious one-bedroom co-op on Jane Street in the West Village. Imani said Lamont had been trying to unload it for over 3 years, but since no one was willing to meet his price, it had become a crash pad of sorts for various friends and artists. She met with a vocal coach, a maniacally cheerful older black woman named Yolanda who flailed her arms a lot. It had taken her aback at first that the label wanted her to see this woman for 3 sessions a week indefinitely. What was wrong with her voice? After Imani explained that even the most seasoned vocalists worked with coaches to keep their instruments tuned, she felt better. There was an appointment with Dr. Regina Lipsky, a sleek woman who wore kitten heels and a white lab coat and proclaimed herself dermatologist to the stars. "Which stars is confidential," she remarked without being asked. Then, again unprovoked, she offered, "Well, Madonna is a former client, and Versace's dead, so there's 2. Happy?" She gave Mimi a diamond peel with a little machine that buffed her skin and put her on antibiotics. Imani scheduled her for a peel every month for the next 6 months. Coming the following week, she had a dentist's appointment. Imani said her teeth were yellowish, but the dentist would fix that. Mimi studied her smile in the bathroom mirror. Her teeth looked white to her. Even Lamont, who exuded a "my time is money and you can't afford a split second" air, invited her out on the town. They went to some boutique opening where there were more bizarrely dressed people on display than there were clothes. Lamont looked like he was going to the Oscars. Mimi, who'd used a bit of her advance money to go on a conservative spending spree at Urban Outfitters, looked like she was going to the mall. And there was a meeting at the office, where she had to sing in the conference room in front of 25 members of the staff. She sang Amazing Grace a cappella. She sat down in the back corner afterward, and 10 of the remaining staffers started talking about her like she wasn't in the room. The words marketing, positioning, imaging, and crossover were thrown around. There was no mention of her singing. After about 20 minutes, Imani led her out, but she realized she'd accidentally left behind the all-important date book. When she went back in a minute to retrieve it, Lamont was saying, "Should we do something about her nose?" Everyone sitting around the table looked up at her as she reflexively touched her nose. No one seemed embarrassed that she had just heard that awful comment. They actually looked like they were checking out her honker, preparing to give Lamont a full report as soon as she departed. "Not to worry," Imani reassured her when Mimi told her what she'd heard. "Your nose is lovely. I'm sure the idea will be vetoed." And yesterday, a girl named Lena had called to make a date for lunch. "Yo, Monty told me to holla," was her opening gambit. The doorman had just buzzed, announcing Lena's arrival. Now Mimi looked through the peephole of the apartment's front door, waiting for her guest to appear. Lena Whitaker breezed into the elevator. Lamont had told her that his new singer Mimi was really hot. Mimi must be truly beautiful for Lamont to describe her that way. He held women up to a rigid standard of beauty and chased all those model bitches. Or maybe he was just trying to hype Mimi up because she was signed to his label. Lena wondered if Lamont had ever described her as really hot. Probably not. At 5'4", all tits and ass with only a hint of a waist, she shied away from all the lowriders she saw crowding the stores. Nevertheless, Lena Whitaker was not one to sweat a bitch no matter how fly, and she was convinced she could hold her own with any looker. After all, she had a lovely face. Slanted eyes with the longest eyelashes, a cute snub nose, and cheekbones that could cut glass. And the brothers appreciated her thickness. She was feeling pretty good about her cute, thick self today. Her cinnamon skin was still lightly sun-kissed after an exciting getaway to Miami a week ago. That somehow made her feel sexier. Her girl, Kiko, a half-Japanese, half-black makeup artist with a ghetto-fabulous flair, was working a photo shoot down there, so Lena had jetted down for the weekend, just to hang. Kiko was wild as hell, so it was guaranteed fun. Who knew she'd hook up there? Crazy G. Crazy G. He was all she could think about now. She'd met him at the album release party for Lady Di, the flashiest and most raunchy female rapper in the game. Her 3 big hits off her debut album, Ladylike, were titled My Clit, Ice Me Down, and On Your Knees, Nigga. The party was at Club Rolex, the strip joint where Lady Di used to work, under the stage name Chanel. There were big-bootied girls flipping their weaves while they slithered around poles, offering lap dances that were paid for by Lady Di's record label. It was the best party Lena had ever been to. Open bar all night. And partying was her forte. Secretly, Lena longed to be outrageous like Lady Di, who looked like a black Pamela Anderson. Tousled blonde tresses and all. Pretty and sexy in an in-your-face way. Lena acted like she was just as confident, but Lady Di, who Vibe magazine had dubbed the goddess of bitch power, didn't have to act. Crazy G, an unsigned rapper and member of Lady Di's camp, was fine as hell. Tattoos all over his muscled arms, smooth coffee brown skin, bald head, and the prettiest smile that shone of gold. The kind of thug that made Lena's pussy contract involuntarily. He'd taken her out to dinner the night after the party to some soul food shack in the Opelika section of Miami. It was amazing how they were driving along and then all of a sudden the surroundings changed. They went from greenery to ghetto in one block. He'd explained that the G actually stood for Greg, but professionally it stood for gangsta. But when it comes to the ladies, it stands for game, he'd joked. Lena, who thought it was cool and kind of retro that these Miami cats rocked gold teeth instead of platinum, wanted to jump over the table and maul him right then and there. The feeling was mutual. "Come on now, girl," he'd whispered later up in her room at the Delano when her Cosabella thong was the only article of clothing she still had on. "Let a nigga get some dessert." He had a tattoo that spelled out Crazy G in Gothic lettering on his washboard stomach, and it was underlined by a long stab wound. He was such a perfect physical specimen that Lena felt a momentary ripple of shame that she wasn't. Didn't bother Crazy G, who enjoyed himself plenty sucking ferociously on her 34D breasts. But if it was pussy he wanted, it was pussy he got. She let him dive in face first, and he made her come so hard she went into spasms. People always said black men didn't like to go downtown, but Lena had found that to be an urban myth. He took off his boxer shorts and revealed the biggest dick she'd ever seen, personally or in a porno. She had felt it all night rubbing up against her, but once he whipped it out, she was forced to flick on the light. Seeing it from all angles, it was a sight to behold. She wanted to devour it like he'd done her, but what would Lady Di think? He was in Di's camp, and tales always traveled. Lena had learned that the hard way. And fuck what you heard, she wasn't no hoe. "Oh, is it 4 in the morning?" Lena had said to him. "I have to get up early for my flight tomorrow." Her flight was actually at 3 in the afternoon, which meant she'd have to get up around 11. But that was early for her. "I should go to bed." "You already in bed, girl," Crazy G had pointed out anxiously. "Come on, just suck me." She'd kicked him out without blowing him or fucking him, but she'd gotten hers. And that story made Lady Di very proud. Ooh, he'd been heated. But he'd paged her 6 times the next day and called her every day since, hadn't he? Lena shuddered to think what Daddy would say if he ever got wind of her dalliance with Crazy G. And there would definitely be more hooking up in the future. Lena's father, Marlon Whitaker, was an entertainment lawyer. No, the powerhouse entertainment lawyer. And now he'd gotten into producing movies, one of which had won an Oscar last year. He was on the board of the Fresh Air Fund, always quick to write a check for any charitable cause. Everyone's favorite guy, blah, blah, and blah. Being Marlon Whitaker's daughter made Lena feel like somebody and nobody at the same time. He used to try to set her up with decent, read boring, boys, spawn of his stuck-up friends. But her father didn't nose too much into her love life anymore, presumably because he was afraid of what he might learn. She'd only ever really dated one guy, a hip-hop producer named Trevor Banks, though she'd gotten busy with plenty. Her father didn't like the way Trevor's jeans sagged in the seat. For Christmas, Daddy had given him a belt. Lena had graduated from Meadowcrest 2 years behind schedule because she'd been kicked out of 4 other private schools. For graduation, Daddy had suggested she go on an all-expenses-paid, year-long overseas trek with a friend so she could, as he put it, expand your narrow, hip-hop-obsessed vision of the world. To Marlon, popular music meant jazz and Motown soul. Rap was not music. In his estimation, it was insolent noise that glorified criminality, degraded women, and broadcast a negative image of African Americans to the world. Sensing that the Find Yourself trip was just a way for him to get rid of her for a year, Lena declined. He was always so busy with his work, and packing her off to India or wherever would make his life just swell. Slow your roll, Daddy. Whenever she was in a pinch, she'd invoke the name of her mother, Nancy, who died of ovarian cancer during her freshman year. Marlon had the Nancy Whitaker Research Fund up and running 6 months later, and the annual gala was a hot ticket on the charity circuit. The sympathy bid would work, and Marlon would back off some, but the truth was, Lena had been buck-ass wild well before her mother's death. She told Daddy she would, in fact, take him up on the all-expenses-paid year off, but she'd spend the year in the New York apartment and set her own schedule. What she didn't tell him was that she didn't really have any good friends to invite. Certainly not anyone who'd want to spend an extended period of time traveling in third-world countries with her, volatile as she was. After that standoff, Marlon had threatened, "You have 1 year, Marlena. Get it together or I'm cutting the purse strings. I mean it this time." That was 8 months ago, and Lena hadn't gotten it together in the least. She shopped, lunched, partied, got drunk, and slept late, struggling to get herself up and out of the family's Park Avenue Classic 8 to do anything at all. Lena's only real goal in life was to snag a famous boyfriend. Now that she had Crazy G hooked, all she had to do was reel him in. Oh, and one small snag. He needed to become famous. He would. She was sure of it. He was a gifted lyricist, well on his way to stardom. Lena looked at it this way. Get to the party early before the VIP gets crowded. She got out of the elevator and made a left. She'd never been to this place when Lamont had lived here. He'd asked her to show his new artist the ropes in New York, and she was happy to do it. This was just what she needed, a new friend. Someone who didn't know how she regularly got trashed in the papers for getting fall-down drunk at some party. Anyway, that was all over. She was turning over a new leaf, starting today. She walked to the end of the hall before realizing she should have made a right. She walked back, and as she reached to ring the bell of 7C, the door swung open. And there was Mimi, smiling. Lamont wasn't just hyping her up. She was hot. Chapter 11.